Somewhere in the Mojave Desert, about 100 miles north of Los Angeles, there is a city with 500 miles of named roads, 200 miles of water piping, and a land area larger than San Jose. It has a population of roughly 14,000 people. Most of it is empty. This is the rise and fall of California City, a $1 billion desert failure. The man with a plan. Nat Mendelson was not the kind of person you'd expect to find buying 82,000 acres of desert. He was born in Czechoslovakia in 1915, came to the United States as a child, grew up in New York City, and graduated from City College in 1935. He had studied sociology, worked as an economist, and later became a professor. He was known for wearing Brooks Brothers suits, a Homburg hat, white gloves, and carrying a gold-tipped cane, the look of a man who had decided that if you were going to be ambitious, you might as well dress the part. After World War II, Mendelson got into real estate. He worked on smaller planned communities in the desert regions of Southern California, picking up the mechanics of land acquisition, sales, and development. By the mid-1950s, he was ready to stop being a supporting player in other people's projects. He wanted his own city. He found it in Kern County, a large parcel of agricultural land. The Mendeburu and Rudnick Ranch, known locally as the M&R Ranch, was growing cotton and alfalfa in the middle of the Mojave Desert, watered by a series of large-capacity wells sunk deep into the Mojave Aquifer. Mendelson was told the wells didn't meaningfully lower the water table, regardless of how much water was pumped, a claim that would prove optimistic over the following decades as development demands increased. But at the time, it sounded like a problem that engineering could handle, and Mendelson was not the kind of person to let a theoretical future complication slow down an ambitious present decision. He moved quickly. By March 1958, Mendelson's California City Development Company had purchased approximately 82,000 acres of Mojave Desert land for a relatively modest sum. Agricultural land in remote Kern County was not expensive in the late 1950s, and the remoteness that made it cheap was, in Mendelson's reading, a temporary condition rather than a permanent one. He had a personal hero, Galileo Galilei, the Italian astronomer, mathematician, and visionary who had been dismissed by contemporaries and vindicated by history. There was an obvious appeal to that biography for a man who was about to propose building a major city in a place most people would have described as obviously unsuitable for one. He named his favorite viewpoint, a remote, scenic butte sitting roughly at the center of his 82,000-acre acquisition, Galileo Hill. He would go out there, stand at the top, and spend days looking over the vast, flat expanse of desert, working through the scale and shape of what he intended to build. What he intended to build was the next Los Angeles, not a suburb of Los Angeles, not a satellite city in the orbit of Los Angeles, a genuine rival 100 miles to the north that would absorb California's expanding population and grow into something comparable in ambition and scale to the city that already dominated Southern California. He was not being modest about it, and he was not being casual about the planning required to back up the ambition. The blueprint for a metropolis. Mendelson hired some of the best planning talent he could find. The master plan was prepared by Smith & Williams, a respected planning firm based in South Pasadena. Landscape architect Garrett Ekbo, a genuinely significant figure in mid-century American landscape and urban design, also contributed to the planning work. These were not discount hires. Mendelson was serious about making the project look legitimate, and the people he brought in were capable of producing a plan that would hold up to scrutiny because the plan itself was not the fraud. The population projections were the optimism, and optimism is not a crime. What they produced was ambitious on a scale that the Mojave Desert had never seen and, as it turned out, would never need to accommodate. The plan called for housing 400,000 people. Some accounts suggest Mendelson privately entertained the figure of 1 million, though whether he said so publicly or kept it as a personal aspiration is not entirely clear from the historical record. There would be a 26-acre Central Park at the city's center, complete with an artificial lake, 2 full golf courses, a 4-story Holiday Inn, parks and schools distributed throughout the grid, commercial districts, industrial zones offering cheap land to manufacturers willing to come and employ residents. The street grid was laid out in a pattern that stretched for miles in every direction, and the street names Mendelson chose tell you something about the scale of his self-regard. Columbia Boulevard, Rutgers Drive, Stanford Street, Yale Avenue. He was building a city that would one day have universities in it, so he named streets after universities preemptively. There were also streets named after car brands: Cadillac Boulevard, Chrysler Drive, Dodge Court, Buick Boulevard. Because California in 1958 was a place where naming a street after a car brand felt like optimism rather than kitsch. And there was, less explicably, a street named after Erwin Rommel, the German general known as the Desert Fox, which is a naming choice that raises some questions that apparently nobody asked at the time. The pitch to buyers was simple, powerful, and not entirely false, which is the most effective kind. Los Angeles is running out of room. The post-war population boom needs somewhere to go. California City is positioned exactly where that growth will land. Buy now, before everyone else figures it out, and the prices reflect what this land is actually going to be worth. The California City Development Company ran quarter-page advertisements in the Los Angeles Times, describing the venture as a giant venture and inevitable growth. Mendelson's sales force grew to thousands of licensed agents operating in offices across the United States and eventually around the world. He trained them through what was effectively a real estate school, built specifically to produce the kind of salespeople who could convey the dream convincingly enough to close a deal on desert land site unseen. In the early months of 1958 and into 1959, the operation was running at a pace that made the whole enterprise look like it might actually work. By April 1959, 60 miles of city streets and water lines had been completed. Property sales had exceeded $7 million and were still climbing rapidly. 67 new homes were under construction simultaneously. A 1,000 tree planting program was underway, calling for 100,000 trees over a decade. Elm, ash, mulberry, things that would need serious water in a desert that averaged less than 7 inches of rain per year. A shopping center with a market, gas station, motel, and 4 stores was being built. A new ribbon was cut somewhere almost every week, with Mendelson posing for photographs in his suit and hat, embodying the image of a man building something inevitable. And still, practically nobody was actually living there. The buyers were buying. The streets were going down. The water lines were going in. But the actual human beings, the 400,000 people the city was designed to contain, were not arriving in anything like the numbers that would have been required to justify the infrastructure being built for them. That gap between the construction happening and the population that was supposed to fill it was the fundamental problem that no amount of marketing or planning ever fully solved. It was not a gap that closed as the years passed. It widened. The selling of a dream. Marketing operation was sophisticated for its era. Mendelson understood that selling raw desert land required building an emotional case, not just a financial one. He wasn't just selling lots. He was selling the story of the next great American city, and he wanted buyers to feel like early arrivals at something historic. The company recruited and licensed thousands of salespeople, running what was effectively a real estate school to train them. They sold the idea that California was expanding and that the smart money got in early. A family could buy a lot with a newly constructed 3-bedroom house for under $10,000. Undeveloped parcels were even cheaper. Mendelson offered undeveloped land for $1 an acre to manufacturers willing to set up operations and employ residents, a deliberate attempt to accelerate the job base that would make the city self-sustaining. At one point, total property sales had passed $7 million and were climbing toward figures that would eventually represent hundreds of millions of dollars in transactions across the company's full operating history. The California City Development Company had thousands of property owners on the books, property owners spread across the country and around the world, many of whom had bought on the strength of a sales pitch and promotional materials rather than from any first-hand experience of the place they had purchased. The number of buyers sounds impressive. What matters is the ratio. The ratio of buyers to actual residents was, from the beginning, deeply unfavorable. The people who bought California City lots largely did not move to California City. They held the lots as investments, waiting for the growth that the salespeople had promised and that the promotional materials had illustrated with architectural renderings of tree-lined boulevards and busy commercial districts. The growth, in the quantities required to justify the purchase prices, did not come. By the time Mendelson sold his shares in the California City Development Company to the Great Western United Corporation in 1969, the city had approximately 1,300 actual residents living within its boundaries. The infrastructure that had been built to serve 400,000 people was serving 1,300. There were hundreds of miles of paved roads leading to empty lots. Water lines ran under streets where no buildings had been constructed. The Central Park Lake sat in the middle of a largely empty grid. The city was incorporated on December 10, 1965, at which point it had 158 square miles of land, approximately 5,900 property owners on record, 817 actual residents, and 232 completed homes. One of the primary drivers of incorporation was to shift the infrastructure maintenance responsibility from the California City Development Company to the city government. That shift of responsibility is a useful thing to note. It is easier to walk away from an obligation you have transferred to someone else. Whether Mendelson was a genuine visionary who simply misread the pace of growth or something more calculated is a question that people who have studied California City's history continue to debate without consensus. Great Western takes over and the trouble begins. Mendelson's exit from the California City Development Company in 1969 did not change the fundamental sales approach. Great Western United Corporation, which had purchased the operation, rebranded the sales entity as Great Western Cities and kept selling the same dream with roughly the same methods. By the late 1970s, those methods had attracted federal attention. The Federal Trade Commission investigated Great Western Cities for what it characterized as false, misleading, and deceptive practices in its California City land sales, a characterization that echoed, in federal legal language, the same basic concern that anyone visiting the property could have identified simply by looking at the disparity between what the brochures promised and what the desert contained. The investigation resulted in a 1977 final judgment secured by the U.S. Attorney's Office and a settlement in which Great Western Cities agreed to pay nearly $4 million to purchasers who had been misled. At the time, one of the more significant consumer protection outcomes the government had secured in this category of land fraud case. It was a meaningful amount of money and a meaningful acknowledgement of what had been happening. It was also, in the full context of California City's sales history, a fraction of what buyers had paid and considerably less than what the ongoing damage would cost. A land-selling company named Great Western Cities had been sued by the federal government for deceiving buyers, had paid a multi-million-dollar settlement, and then Great Western Cities declared bankruptcy in the early 1980s. The bankruptcy was the end of that specific entity. It was not the end of the approach. That bankruptcy technically ended the company's operations, but did not end the basic proposition that had driven California City's land sales since 1958. There is land out here, and if you buy it now, it will be worth more later. The infrastructure sat in the desert. The roads, the water lines, the street signs naming boulevards after Ivy League universities, the Central Park Lake catching the Mojave sun, as evidence of an enormous investment that had not produced the returns it promised. Properties that had been sold for thousands of dollars were worth hundreds or less. Land that had been described as being on the path of inevitable growth had been on the same path for 20 years without the growth arriving. Buyers who had purchased California City lots in the 1960s and 1970s and who reached the 1980s holding property that had appreciated little or not at all had limited options. They could continue holding in the hope that something would eventually change. They could sell at a loss. Or they could simply stop paying property taxes, allow the land to revert to the county in a tax sale, and walk away. Many chose the last option. The county then auctioned those parcels off, often at extremely low prices, which made them available for purchase by parties who were willing to wait and willing to sell the same dream again. California City's history of land sales did not end with Great Western City's bankruptcy. It continued, just under new management, with a new name, a new brochure, and a new generation of buyers who had not been around for the previous round. The Ghost Grid. Before getting to the next chapter, it helps to understand what California City actually looks like from the air, because it is one of the stranger things visible on any satellite map of North America. If you open Google Maps and look at the Mojave Desert north of Los Angeles, you can find California City easily. What you will see is an enormous grid of paved roads stretching across miles of desert. Streets running parallel, streets crossing perpendicular, cul-de-sacs, blocks, all the geometric organization of a planned urban environment, and then, at street level, almost nothing. Scrubland. Jackrabbits. Wind. The occasional house or cluster of buildings, surrounded by miles of empty lots. The roads go somewhere. They just don't go anywhere people are. This is what urban planners, photographers, and the increasingly large community of people who find California City genuinely fascinating have taken to calling the ghost grid, the physical infrastructure of a city that was built ahead of a population that never fully materialized. Nearly 500 miles of named roads, 200 miles of water piping running beneath those roads, a central park with a man-made lake in its center, surrounded by mostly empty desert, a regional airport. California City covers 203.63 square miles, making it the third largest city in California by land area, behind only Los Angeles and San Diego, and ahead of San Jose, Sacramento, San Francisco, Long Beach, Anaheim, and every other city in the state. Population at the 2020 census, 14,973 people. For context, San Jose has approximately 1.03 million people in a smaller area. Fresno has around 545,000. Even modest California cities like Santa Rosa have populations several times California cities. The land area that Mendelson planned for 400,000 people, the figure in the master plan, is occupied by a population roughly equivalent to a mid-size American high school district. The ratio of infrastructure to people is difficult to grasp from street level. From a satellite map, it is immediately and vividly apparent. The ghost grid has become one of the more photographed landscapes in the Mojave Desert. Not because it is beautiful, exactly, but because it is so legible as a document of ambition versus outcome. Every street that ends in scrubland is a sentence that begins, and then everyone moved here, and stops before reaching the period. Silver Saddle and the second act of fraud. In the 1980s, a man named Thomas Maney purchased much of the land that Great Western Cities had left behind when it went bankrupt. Maney had actually worked for Great Western Cities. He knew exactly how the land sales operation functioned, who the buyers were, and how the pitch was constructed. He had been present for the FTC settlement. He had watched that entire chapter of California City history from the inside. He then did it again. Maney created Silver Saddle Ranch and Club, a desert resort on the outskirts of California City, at the foot of Galileo Hill, the exact same hill where Nat Mendelson had stood decades earlier, looking out over 82,000 acres and imagining a city of 400,000 people. The choice of location was either an extraordinary coincidence or a deliberate act of inheritance. Silver Saddle presented itself as a rustic ranch-style resort. Taxidermy jackalopes on the walls, decorative wagon wheels, Western-themed design that aimed for charming and landed somewhere between kitschy and tired. It offered weekend getaways. It had a pool. It had a bar. It had peacocks wandering the grounds. For reasons that no one seems to have formally documented, what it actually was, according to the California Department of Business Oversight, was a mechanism for a securities fraud scheme that recycled the California City dream one more time for a new generation of buyers who had never heard of Nat Mendelson or Great Western Cities or the FTC settlement of the 1970s. Starting in 2011 and continuing for years, Silver Saddle's operators reached potential investors through supermarket raffles and social media. Winners received what appeared to be a free weekend at the ranch, a vacation in the desert. No obvious catch. The catch was the mandatory sales presentation. On the final morning of a stay at Silver Saddle, visitors were separated by ethnicity and paired with salespeople who spoke their primary language. The scheme specifically and deliberately targeted Filipino, Chinese, and Latino communities with members who frequently spoke English as a second language and who, according to the state's complaint, were often unable to fully read the contracts they were being asked to sign. The pitch was called Land Banking Plus, or the Galileo Project. It offered fractional interests in approximately 1,000 acres of raw desert land near Silver Saddle. The land, salespeople claimed, was in the path of a new gold rush. Businessmen like Paul Allen and Elon Musk were supposedly investing or considering investing in the area, The land would be worth a fortune when California City finally grew into its infrastructure. By now, the opportunity wouldn't wait. The land was, according to state investigators, nearly worthless at the prices being charged, and it was sold for up to 100 times its fair market value. More than 2,000 people bought into the scheme, paying up to $30,000 each. Silver Saddle brought in more than $30 million between 2011 and its shutdown. Salespeople who received complaints from investors threatening them with lawsuits rather than engaging with their concerns. Investors who stopped making payments found their parcels repurchased at county tax auctions, often by Silver Saddle itself, far below what the investors had paid. "I wish they realize how much they cost all the families," said Ben Perez of Milpitas, California, who invested more than $31,000 he had saved to open a food truck, after a Silver Saddle saleswoman assured him he would double his money in a year. "I wish they would give the money back to us." The California Department of Business Oversight filed a lawsuit against Silver Saddle in October 2019, shutting it down and appointing a receiver to take control of its assets. In May 2022, the state of California added criminal charges: conspiracy to commit a crime, grand theft of personal property, securities fraud. Thomas Maney was 83 years old when the criminal charges were filed. Silver Saddle Ranch is now permanently closed and remains under court receivership. Most of the investors will not fully recover what they put in. What California City is today. The city that Nat Mendelson envisioned as the rival to Los Angeles has, as of the mid-2020s, a population of approximately 15,000 people. It is the third largest city in California by land area and one of the least densely populated incorporated cities in the state by most measures. It functions. There is a government, a police department, a fire department, schools, a public library, a small commercial district. But it functions at a scale that is almost entirely disconnected from what was planned for the land it occupies. The economy that keeps those 15,000 people there is practical and unpretentious. Edwards Air Force Base, about 18 miles to the southeast, employs a significant portion of the California City workforce. The California City Correctional Facility, a state prison, employs others. Mojave Air and Spaceport, located about 28 miles to the west, has attracted private aerospace operations and provides employment for some residents. Hyundai and Kia maintain an automotive proving ground on the southwestern portion of the city's vast territory. A useful reminder that 203 square miles of flat, remote desert has genuine practical value for testing vehicles that you don't want anyone to see before they're ready. The aerospace and automotive testing industries have given California City an employer base that Mendelson's 1958 vision, oriented toward manufacturing and residential growth, did not anticipate. In 2016, California City became the first city in Kern County to permit commercial cannabis cultivation, anticipating eventual annual tax revenues of $10 million or more. By the first quarter of 2023, the city had collected approximately $98,000 in cannabis-related revenues. That is not $10 million. It is, however, consistent with the broader pattern of California City projections. The number you arrive at is usually significantly smaller than the number you started with. The ghost grid is still there. Satellite images of California City still show those miles of paved desert roads running parallel and perpendicular to each other across miles of Mojave scrubland, most of them ending without ceremony in the desert. The Central Park Lake still exists. Some neighborhoods around the town center are quietly functional, with houses, small businesses, and the kinds of services a small desert community needs to operate. Homes continue to be built, slowly, in various parts of the grid. The pace of growth would not have surprised Nat Mendelson in 1958. It would, however, have been a profoundly disappointing answer to the question of what California City was going to become. Journalist Emily Guerin of KPCC/LA has spent years reporting on California City's deteriorating water infrastructure and the Silver Saddle fraud scheme, eventually producing a 7-part podcast series called California City, which was released in 2020. Her reporting began as an assignment about the drought and the city's leaking, rusting water lines. Infrastructure that had been built for a city of 400,000 and was maintaining itself on a budget suited for 14,000. This was only supposed to be a story about water, Garin said in the podcast's opening episode. But in California, stories about water always end up being about money, power, and deception. She was not wrong. The water infrastructure needed repair that the city couldn't fully afford, because a city built for 400,000 people that houses 14,000 does not have the tax base to maintain 400,000 people's worth of infrastructure. And the reason 14,000 people live there instead of 400,000 is the sales operation that built those water lines in the first place. California City is a story about water that became a story about land sales, that became a story about fraud. A story that repeated itself across 6 decades with different names and different brochures, and the same desert, and the same empty lots at the end of the same long roads. The roads are still out there. You can drive them, hundreds of miles of paved streets named after universities and car brands, running parallel and perpendicular across the desert, mostly empty on a weekday afternoon, going nowhere in particular with considerable municipal commitment. The street signs still say Stanford and Yale and Columbia. The Central Park Lake still catches the Mojave sun. Galileo Hill is still sitting in the same position it occupied in 1958, when Nat Mendelson stood at its peak in his Brooks Brothers suit, looking out over 82,000 acres and imagining something extraordinary. What California City actually became is, in its own way, extraordinary. Not the way Mendelson intended, but extraordinary as a document of what American ambition looks like when it runs into the limits of American reality. It is a city-sized object lesson in the distance between a vision and a population. It is the third largest city in California by land area, and a place where most of that land is still waiting for someone to do something with it. It is a place where the same sales pitch was delivered to 3 generations of buyers, and where that pitch finally attracted criminal charges on the 3rd try. He wasn't the last one to stand on Galileo Hill with big ideas. He just happened to be the first. And the ones who came after him, who looked at the same desert and saw the same opportunity, knew exactly what they were selling and sold it anyway. If you found this story worth your time, hit like and subscribe. There's a lot more American history like this, hiding in plain sight on satellite maps of the desert, waiting for someone to look closely enough.